A subscription to the China Africa Project's email newsletter is like getting a daily China Africa intelligence briefing delivered straight to your inbox every weekday at 6 a.m. Washington time. You'll get an in-depth review of everything going on in politics, trade, tech, culture, and more. And we don't just focus only on Africa, but also the Middle East and what China's doing throughout the global south. Try it out free for 30 days. See if you like it. After that, subscriptions are just $7 a month for teachers and students and $15 a month for everyone else. Sign up today at ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. Once again, that's ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe.
The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP aims to improve the quality of reporting on Africa-China relations through reporting grants, workshops, and other opportunities for journalists. More information at africachinareporting.co.za and our dedicated training website at africachinatraining.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, it has been a very busy week for international summits. Last Friday, we had a really interesting summit among German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron, and Chinese President Xi Jinping. Also, on the same day, there was a summit with Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga and U.S. President Joe Biden. Now, in that Biden summit, there was a lot of anticipation that the two leaders were going to talk about what we have framed as an alternative BRI. Now, this was an issue that Joe Biden brought up in a phone call with UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson when he said, and I'm going to quote here, "We should have a similar initiative pulling from the democratic states, helping those communities around the world that need help." And he was talking about building sustainable infrastructure. Now, this is not the first time that we have talked about building an alternate to the BRI from the United States. Back in 2019, during the Trump administration, on the sidelines of an ASEAN summit out here in Southeast Asia, it was up in Bangkok, in fact, the United States, Japan, and Australia came up with this idea to create something called a Blue Dot Network. Now, the idea here was to resolve the challenge that there's no single globally accepted standard for sustainable infrastructure investments. And when you hear the Americans and Japanese in particular talk about their infrastructure ideas compared to the Chinese, they always come up with this idea of, quote unquote, and I'm using air quotes here, quality infrastructure. Now, the reason why I say that is because they differentiate and distinguish their infrastructure projects from Chinese infrastructure projects as presumably being of higher quality and also being more environmentally sustainable. Now, on the Blue Dot Network website, they have it buried deep on the State Department website. This is a program that really went nowhere fast. But let me read you about the Blue Dot Network because we're going to talk about it today. And this is a quote as to what it is. So I'm reading from their site. "The Blue Dot Network will bring together governments, the private sector, and civil society under shared standards for global infrastructure development. Point number 2, the network will certify infrastructure projects that demonstrate and uphold global infrastructure principles." That presumably is the Blue Dot. So it's like the good housekeeping seal of approval. Then we also have certification by the Blue Dot Network, which will serve as a globally recognized symbol of market-driven, transparent, and financially sustainable development projects. And they finish by saying, "By proposing a common standard of project excellence, the Blue Dot Network will attract private capital to infrastructure projects in developing and emerging economies." Now, in the 2 years since that was launched, the Blue Dot Network has gone absolutely nowhere. And in that time, the Chinese have, okay, their spending on infrastructure is down, but it is still pretty much one of the major financiers of global infrastructure, especially in places like Africa. Why do you think, Cobus, that the Blue Dot Network has been such a miserable failure?
You know, that's an interesting question, and I think it has a lot to do with simply the kind of realities of politics in the US over the last 2 years. I don't think the Blue Dot Network, kind of went nowhere necessarily because it's inherently, kind of a flawed idea. I think it was a victim of the kind of, the Trump administration's tendency to announce stuff and then move on without particularly kind of implementing them. So I'd be very interested to see whether it kind of gains more legs under the Biden administration. But I think the bigger question actually is why this kind of initiative was announced now, and it happened in the context of a whole bunch of different kind of international players are very interested in the issue of infrastructure standards at the moment. So you're seeing think tanks around the world doing a lot of work on infrastructure standard setting. My think tank, where SIA, where I'm based, we're involved in 2 of those different projects at the same time, and there's a lot of discussion about how infrastructure provision should be standardized across the world. And with it, this idea of that standardization will also attract private capital. That's the other big thing about infrastructure provision, is trying to get more private capital involved. So the idea of all of this is that there will be a way of rolling out infrastructure that will also help to mitigate the climate crisis, and boost development in a way that will then kind of boost development along the lines of how certain kind of big players want it boosted. So that means there are Chinese ideas of how to boost it and Western ideas, including Japan, kind of, ways of boosting it. This kind of, there are all of these different kind of processes of standard setting are kind of like happening at the same time, and in some ways kind of car crashing into each other, mostly also kind of driven by geopolitics.
So it's interesting because you bring up 2 divergent points here. There's a geopolitical track for the Blue Dot Network, which was, or part of this effort to confront China. This is the same framework that you can put the Development Finance Corporation, the revitalized U.S. Exim Bank, obviously the Clean Network, which was the effort to kind of get countries to divest from using Huawei equipment. And this was all part of the Trump administration's global effort to confront China all over the world. So that's the geopolitical track. Then, Cobus, as you brought up, is the sustainability track, which is to really raise the quality of infrastructure to make it more environmentally sustainable. And so we're going to focus on the second track today. And because almost like the rare white rhino, an article that popped up on the radar that came out in defense of the Blue Dot Network, or at least to revitalize the effort of the Blue Dot Network. It was on the Hill website, Blue Dot, How to Raise China's Infrastructure Climate Standards. You don't see these kind of articles very often mentioning the Blue Dot Network, so I was very intrigued. It was written by Elizabeth Losos, who's a senior fellow at Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, and she also leads a research program on sustainable infrastructure. Elizabeth, a very good morning to you from Chapel Hill, North Carolina.
Thank you, Eric and Cobus. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
It's wonderful to have you here with us. And I will say right from the beginning that in your article, you are not necessarily advocating for the Blue Dot per se in terms of any vested interest. You are just coming at it from the point of view of this might be an interesting vehicle to use in order to promote sustainable infrastructure development. That being said, this was not an issue that was addressed by either Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga or by President Joe Biden. You wrote your column in anticipation of the summit that took place last Friday. And in your column, the opening line was the U.S. has recently signaled that it is ready to respond to the economic and geopolitical threats posed by China's Belt and Road Initiative. And I guess the question that I have is it ready, though? I mean, is the U.S. really ready to confront or to deal with this issue? Simply because if it wasn't raised at the summit between the Japanese Prime Minister and the U.S. President, 2 forces that are motivated and well-funded to actually pull off an alternate BRI, then it really begs the question as to whether or not these governments are committed to that idea.
Well, Eric, I certainly wasn't in the room when they were speaking, so I don't have a full sense of what actually was discussed, but...
It wasn't in their final joint statement, is I guess where I'm coming from.
Right. Right. But it did mention that they talked about infrastructure, sort of deep down in the statement. And additionally, I can say that since I published that article just a week ago, several people have reached out to me to say that indeed there are discussions going on in various places about revitalizing and using the Blue Dot Network. To me, and I think that Cobus did a wonderful job sort of setting out what the issues are. I think that whether it's the Blue Dot or some sort of resurrection of sustainable infrastructure, competing with China's BRI and hopefully getting China's BRI to step up as well and become a true green BRI, it's really a perfect storm right now. It's the moment for this to happen. And I have a sense that it actually is happening behind the scenes, but we'll find out in the coming weeks, I think.
The involvement of Japan in the Blue Dot Network wasn't surprising for me, simply because, Japan is a big infrastructure provider around the world, and it's been kind of gunning to position itself as such, particularly in Southeast Asia, and so it's been campaigning under this label of quality infrastructure in the G20, for example. It's a real kind of key pillar of its engagements with Africa under the TCAD platform. So it made sense for me that Japan would sign on to the Blue Dot Network. I was wondering a little more about the US's position there, because one of the things that we frequently see from when we speak with experts on US Africa relations is that the US has somewhat retreated from the international infrastructure provision game. So do you see how do you see this kind of working out on the US side? Do you foresee that US companies would want to step up and kind of move much more aggressively into this infrastructure space?
Absolutely. And I think the key from a very much a U.S. perspective is the America Jobs Plan that Biden has put forward. If the U.S. does pursue an infrastructure, anything close to what has been proposed, and of course that is still a big if, part of it is really about developing the new technologies and beefing up the industries that are going to require exporting technologies, but also joining forces with countries all over the world to be able to bring a lot of these new low-carbon technologies to essentially the world. So it's really in the U.S.'s economic interest. I think what China showed so nicely with the Belt and Road is how an industrial policy where you use loans and try and encourage the private sector from your country to be able to advance your technologies really works, both from an economic and geopolitical sense. And so I think this is actually a moment where the U.S. is going to need such an outward-facing program if they're going to be working within the U.S. to develop all this capacity.
Why do you think that the U.S. has any credibility to build infrastructure in developing countries when its own infrastructure is so decrepit? I mean, if you drive on an American road, where I come from California, and there's just potholes everywhere. The bridges can't hold the traffic. The airports are old. I'm just wondering where the confidence comes from that the United States is actually capable of doing this, even if it did want to, given that it doesn't have the infrastructure companies. It imports most of the raw materials like steel and other things from China. So where does the confidence that we could actually do something like this come on, given that we haven't really been able to maintain our own infrastructure very well?
Well, I guess I'm an optimist. I think this is the big transformation that the Biden administration is moving towards. This is the future, and we've shown time and time again that we can step up when all the pieces are properly aligned. And at the scale that the current administration is proposing, it's possible, and they don't have to be. It's not a zero-sum game. If you have companies that are working inside the U.S., that doesn't mean that other companies can't work outside the U.S. And we've got a very strong research industry that is working on the next technologies coming down the road. And that's really where a lot of this will be coming from, us remaining at the forefront of innovation and pushing it both in the U.S. and outside. So it is true. I mean, you're absolutely right. We've been ignoring our infrastructure for decades, really a half a century. And so this is the moment. But the important thing is that if you also have to put this in the context of the administration's very strong push right now for a real climate solution. And if they are successful getting the rest of the world to increase their climate commitments, and yet at the same time we don't move forward on infrastructure, there are other countries, China being the top of the list, that are going to just move into those markets, whether it's electric vehicles or hydrogen fuels or solar panels and wind turbines, et cetera. They're already there. And if we push everyone to commit further, there's just going to be that much more demand. The U.S. really has to push forward if we're not going to be left behind.
But the United States and China together produce 40% of all the carbon emissions in the world. Rather than focus on other countries, why not focus on improving efficiency of American cars and focus domestically rather than internationally, simply because right now the problem is the United States and China. It's not Botswana.
Well, that's true. And that is what the main focus is, not just on the U.S. and China, but the other big emitters as well. But that's not enough. There was an interesting article a couple years ago by Majun and also Simon Zedek that pointed out for the BRI countries, not China, but the 126 BRI countries, if they continue on the same path they're going with infrastructure and very carbon-intensive infrastructures, and the rest of the world, the U.S., China, the EU, et cetera, were to move on to meeting their Paris climate targets, we would still get close to 3, maybe even 4 degrees of warming, because these countries are growing their carbon emissions quite quickly. And so it has to be an all-in. Every country is ultimately, by 2050, going to have to move on to a low-carbon economy if we're really going to be able to keep to 1.5 to 2 degrees of warming.
To return to the Blue Dot Network itself, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the standard setting aspect of it. Like, do we know so far, kind of, which kind of partners are involved in the standard setting? How is it going to work? How the standards are going to be enforced? Just as per illustration, I mean, China is facing a lot of heat for funding coal-powered electricity plants in the global south, and several of them in Africa. And for on our side, we've been like hitting China a lot on that issue. But it was I read a New York Times account of this recent summit between the US and Japan, and in the last paragraph it just very briefly mentioned that the US, one of the points of discussion was that the US was trying to get Japan to stop funding coal-powered power plants around the world, and Japan refused to commit to that. So how, kind of when there's so little agreement actually between Western and kind of democratic kind of international powers who on the face of it would seem to be on the same page on these issues, but in reality frequently are not. How are they going to be herding these cats, kind of in one direction in getting a kind of a unified standard setting in action?
That's a great question, and let me answer it sort of in 2 parts. The first is globally, and then second, specifically to the Blue Dot Network and its partners. Globally, you were, Cobus, right on when saying there are all these efforts across the world. It's not that we don't know how to build sustainable infrastructure or what it should include. It's getting everyone to agree on a standard and then helping those local governments, government agencies, engineers, contractors, financiers understand what it is. And right now, there are just a huge number of different efforts going on trying to do that. So what role would the Blue Dot Network play? My understanding, and remember that I'm coming in from the outside, so I don't have any inside understanding of what's really happening, but I believe that in 2019, when it was announced, and for the first year or so, they tried to come up with their own standards, and it just pretty much stalled out. So I don't think at this point there really are a particular set of standards that the Blue Dot Network is approaching, nor do I think they should be the ones to figure that out, because there are quite a few groups. I think that one of the efforts the World Bank is leading with a bunch of partners, but HSBC is a big, one of their biggest partners is called Fast Infra, which would be a labeling system for essentially the financial industry to understand what is sustainable infrastructure. That might be something. The trick would be not so much for the Blue Network to spend time figuring this out, but they could help if we got the governments at the highest level to referee, help sort of put their finger on the scale and try and get agreement as to which that standard should be, and then promote it. And it could be promoted as the Blue Dot, or it doesn't have to be under that name, but it's really just getting it out there, but also to those who actually would need it to understand what it is and what it entails. Now, back to the other part of the question, and this is where it gets interesting about how are we going to get these countries like Japan, that has been a major exporter of coal, to get on board on something which would require them to stop exporting and also ideally reduce their own dependence. Well, I think, to me, that's the beauty of this Blue Dot Network. The U.S. is essentially partnering with two of the countries, Australia and Japan, that have been laggards in this field. They're not partnering with the EU or even South Korea, which has a bit of a mixed situation. But they've picked two countries which are a bit slow, but are very eager to join with the U.S. to have a united front against China. And both Australia and Japan seem to be showing that they would be willing to, they want to get on board. They're also being pressured internally. And so if the U.S. and John Kerry with Joe Biden can really get them on board and get them to agree no more coal, plus all these other standards, that would really be huge. And it would be very easy to bring the EU and many of the other developed world countries, as well as the multilateral development banks and others, along.
I'm having a hard time getting my head around this, that the United States is the number one oil and gas producer in the world today. So I'm presuming that if we're going to ask the Australians to stop exporting coal and the Japanese to stop importing coal, that the same demands would be placed on the United States to cut back on its petroleum business, which is a non-starter in U.S. domestic politics, given that a lot of the petroleum does come out of red states, which you can see where that would lead us. At the end of the day, concessions have to be made. And it doesn't seem like that the United States or any of the wealthy countries, Japan, Australia, pick your country, has ever made a concession that fundamentally inconveniences the constituencies of those people. Like, the Americans have never had to give up anything for the environment, right? I can't think of one thing. I mean, we feel that it's our right to drive a V8, a gas guzzler, with one person in it, no public transportation, all of that. And all of this depends on us making tremendous changes to our lifestyle. And here I am in a country like Vietnam, which is on the other end of that spectrum. We are not only now the recipient of the impact of climate change, where just a small adjustment in the pH level of the Mekong Delta can affect the rice production for hundreds of millions of people who depend on that food supply. And at the same time, a lot of the manufacturing is coming down from China, so the air quality is getting worse, and they're building massive amounts of infrastructure using some Chinese infrastructure, some Japanese. So it's really an intersection of all these different things. I guess my question is, everything you've talked about is aspirational, that hopefully one day the Americans will do this, hopefully one day the Australians will do this, but we don't have time for that aspiration given the fact that these climate emergencies are happening right now. Is this actually reasonable in an environment in a 50-50 Senate where maybe in a year and a half the House turns back to the Republicans, Joe Biden doesn't have the mandate that he has? Is this actually possible to do?
Well, I think we'll find out on Friday when Biden hosts his Climate Leaders Summit what the U.S. is really going to offer. They're going to be announcing their revised 2030 targets. And you're absolutely right that they're really banking on the sort of the pull rather than the push, the idea that renewables are getting much cheaper and they're cleaner and they have all sorts of other positive elements which will make them attractive for infrastructure development and economic recovery, et cetera, rather than trying to focus on weaning us from fossil fuels. But there's definitely going to be some of that, some of the latter in this. There's not going to be carbon taxes. That's pretty much off the table at this point. In the U.S., we're talking about. But it's pretty clear that regulations are going to start to be amped up. There's going to be a lot of focus on places that have managed to do some good work, such as California has actually really been in the lead, et cetera. So I'm hopeful. And if the U.S. can't step up, doesn't do anything, even with this 50-50 Congress, then, we are fried, as one might say. We really just don't have that much time. But there is a lot of energy, and there's also, I can tell you that a lot of the people in the administration, the political folks, came from the Obama administration, a huge number. And as one person told me, they sort of have PTSD as to seeing what happened to all the work they did at the end of that 8 years and how quickly it was erased. So they are working right now like there is no tomorrow. They see the midterms as the endpoint to when they can get all these policies underway, and we'll see. But there's an effort underway to really put our house in order, and I'm hopeful. I have to be.
It's very intriguing for me, kind of watching all of these developments from the outside. That the Biden administration went ahead and mentioned these these kind of massive domestic kind of initiatives, at the same time as raising possible massive international developments, initiatives. In order to counter the BRI, and it seems obviously America is an extremely rich country, but it also seemed politically difficult to maybe to kind of to get all of that money released, or all of that money kind of like allocated for both of these kind of initiatives at the same time. Would it be correct to think of something like the Blue Dot Network as part of kind of a way of kind of kickstarting it domestically, and then hoping that domestic kind of standard setting development and technological kind of advancement will then kind of trickle out internationally? Or am I misreading it?
To my knowledge, they're not that far along. And remember, they're still hiring up people, particularly in the State Department. It's still pretty early in the administration. So I don't know that they're that far along that they have a plan of doing the Blue Dot Network domestic and then going international. I think it's always been considered a global standard, not for focus in the U.S. In fact, one of the things that I often hear it compared to is the Energy Star ratings that have been so successful for so long in the U.S. on appliances, that will show someone when they look at an appliance how much it's going to cost them in energy costs over time and how clean it is. So I'm not sure that they're looking to have that so much for U.S. infrastructure as a global standard, which could, of course, still be used in the U.S.
Yeah, well, kind of that too, just to further along that point, like that is something that I was wondering about in the past, about because so much of the current international conversation about standard setting on infrastructure is driven by the US and Europe and Japan, many of whom are very very concerned about how much money China is kind of rolling out internationally in infrastructure, and at the same time kind of facing, for many of them, it's kind of politically unfeasible to just simply announce, also a kind of $1 trillion kind of rollout internationally. So I was wondering whether all of the energy put on standard setting is actually translates into trying to have a kind of a voice and an influence in this international movement without necessarily having to pay that much for it, because standard setting obviously is cheaper than to announce a list of standards and to have a certification system is much cheaper than actually rolling out all that infrastructure oneself. Do you think that's fair?
Well, my guess is that might have crossed the mind of the Trump folks when they first put this out there, but it is a real need. And, in many ways it is, you can think of it as the evolution of the international development banks that in the late 80s, 90s, they were really being pummeled internationally for all their bad loans, many of which were environmental. Many of them were large-scale infrastructure loans that had very bad environmental and social damages. And that's what led to the safeguards being adopted and now are quite extensive in all the big banks. And you could see this as sort of a further development of that. It's needed to have such standards and certification. It's not enough. You then need the investments, and you also need the investments to use these standards. But it is a first and important step.
When I hear you talk about innovation, technology, research, sustainability, clean, what comes to mind is that's expensive. That's a luxury. Countries like here in Vietnam or in many African countries will look at dirtier energy and dirtier infrastructure because it's more cost efficient. And then the trade-off comes between, do we then take on more debt? Because even a 15% premium for cleaner energy means 15% more that the constituents of that country have to pay back. So there's a debt sustainability issue that comes into the picture then at that point too. So either more debt or more expensive, but it doesn't seem like all this clean energy and these clean technologies are cheaper than the dirtier ones. Sure, they're coming down in price. Solar's coming down in price, but it's not where coal is today. And for a lot of countries, it's not a choice between solar and coal. It's between coal and nothing.
Eric, I might, sorry to interrupt you. I think I might disagree with you. I think solar is now officially, solar and wind, I think is now officially cheaper than coal. I think for where it kind of becomes muddled, and sorry, not to mess up your question, but where it becomes muddled is that for a lot of global South countries, they have coal reserves. So from their individual perspective, it's frequently cheaper. But I think objectively, what I've heard recently is that solar and wind is now officially the cheapest form of energy.
There's a bunch of different components in that. So, for example, here in Vietnam, I'll use that as an example. They've been able to generate a lot more electricity using solar, but the distribution and storage is very expensive and very complicated, and that they haven't been able to do.
Yeah.
So we're talking about the whole ecosystem that goes to the consumer. not just the generation of it, which is one piece. You're right. Solar panels are cheap. Generating electricity from the sun, much cheaper. But storing it, distributing it, and all the other pieces of it and building into the network, they haven't been able to do in this developing country, and I think a lot of other developing countries. So I guess, Elizabeth, how do you balance that question of clean versus cost?
Yeah, well, I agree that solar and clean energy is coming down. It is a country-by-country basis exactly what the cost and benefit trade-off is, whether it's actually less expensive than fossil fuel. But it's going down, and it will get cheaper. Part of, at the end of the day, there are a lot of additional costs, such as pollution, which these countries are having to pay either now or later. And there are, a lot of what we've talked about today are, of course, private sector money or money through Exim Banks, the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, et cetera. A lot of these are loans, but there's also money available for countries, particularly the lowest income countries, that are more concessional or grants. And so at some level, some of these countries really are going to need assistance, not just more investments and loans, but actually will need grants to help them be able to transfer. And there is a big green climate fund, and there are other initiatives underway to help these countries with that translation. But it is a global problem, and so it does need a global solution, including some sort of transfer from developed countries to developing countries that isn't just on a loan basis.
But I just don't see the political appetite in any developed country to build infrastructure in poor countries. It's a non-starter in the UK, in the US. I mean, I can see Tucker Carlson right now on Fox News going, why the hell are we building, highways in Botswana when our own highways here suck? In order to justify that transfer of wealth, you're going to have an enormous reservoir of political will, which in Europe right now doesn't seem like it's there, nor does it seem like it's in the U.S.
Right, and that's why the package has to include the U.S. engaged in promoting its own technologies, its own EV cars, charging stations, solar panels, et cetera. It has to, for these countries to be able to sell it politically, they need to be involved in actually getting out there. It has to be a much bigger package, and that's what they're trying to wrap all together right now with the climate summit and with pushing back against China, with potentially the Blue Dot Network or other efforts. I mean, you can see all this, of course, with telecommunications and Huawei. That's a different matter, but it's kind of a similar sort of situation where it's a competition for who is going to be the ones producing the technology, producing the jobs both at home and abroad.
Well, this is what I was kind of aiming at with my previous question about whether there's going to be some form of spillover, because it seems to me much easier to sell kind of green jobs, kind of massive kind of move towards sustainable energy, new forms of public mass transit and so on, if it's benefiting Americans and giving Americans jobs and boosting American companies domestically, so that made me wonder, like, what the kind of timeline is for the international part of this, kind of whether it would need to first be kind of rolled out domestically to have the kind of both the kind of profit but particularly the kind of political feasibility to then be able to kind of move internationally.
Right, and a place like the U.S. or Japan, if we can also say, and look, by the way, this is helping our global competition with China. This is, by us investing in these areas, we're actually pushing back against China. That helps with the calculus as well.
It feels like that's always part of the calculus. And even in your column, it was hard to tell if the motivation for the Blue Dot was as much about pushing back about China as it was about building sustainable infrastructure. Can you separate these two? Or are they linked inexorably with one another?
I think it's a perfect storm. I don't think, all the reasons you all are putting forward, pushing one or the other is tough. But putting them together helps. And this might be the moment. This moment in time may be just the moment to push them both together.
Yeah, it seems to me, it's interesting for me that this kind of international rollout is characterized increasingly, by members of the Quad particularly as being the democracies of the world versus the one particular big non-democracy. Because it seems to me that climate change in a lot of ways represents a kind of a existential challenge to democracies as we know them now, not least because they've shown themselves to be so easy to manipulate. Like the research that came out a few years ago that the George H.W. Bush administration was moving quite steadily in the direction of climate mitigation measures that would really have helped the global warming problem massively, and that it ended up then being diverted away from that due to, among others, to corporate pressure, but also because Western democracies have shown to be incredibly easy to manipulate in terms of just by pumping corporate money into kind of fostering culture wars. So it's become very, very easy, relatively easy to kind of to hold back this kind of progress simply by funding more and more kind of controversy around it, and in the process kind of hijacking the conversation to a place where it becomes very difficult to think of any kind of common good. How do you think the US is going to overcome that particular challenge?
Oh boy, that's really a tough one. And I can say not only is what you just said true, but all of that effort to demonize climate science in the U.S. actually spilled over into Australia and created a similar response, in part due to the Murdoch empire in Australia. But so it went well beyond just the U.S. shores. Well, we've hit a point where we're going to find out if a administration committed to addressing this issue, even at some cost, is able to make headway. And it's taken us up to this point when we could have addressed this many, many times over the last 25 years at a far less cost. If we can't do it now, and, I understand what you said, it being such a close Congress, Senate in the U.S., it's going to be tough. But this is the moment to find out if democracy can address such an existential threat, which is a major public good, a clean, healthy earth, versus these parties. But it does help that the private sector, which is now really getting on board, because many of them see this not just because they believe it's the right thing to do, but they see this as in their economic future. And so, yes, you still have some elements of the fossil fuel industry pushing back, but they're smaller and quieter as you see strong push forward in many other sectors. And so, frankly, the private sector has been pushing climate for, even before the Trump administration, much faster than the government has. And that may be the answer, for better or for worse, that's what we're going to need to have happen in order to move forward.
In your column, and we'll close out our discussion on this theme, in your column, again, you had two tracks. You're talking about sustainable infrastructure and also China as well. You've talked about the urgency of the moment and that time is in fact running out. If the Biden administration is unable to do this, and that presumes then that a Republican may come back into power in the future, what are the consequences? And what does that say about the environment and also China?
Well, I mean, obviously, one consequence is if we can't control emissions in the next by 2030, if we can't really get a handle on it, then there will be huge environmental costs, which I think we've already begun to see through the sea level rise and forest fires and flooding, et cetera. So I'm not going to go into what are the costs of not being able to control this. But from a more, political point of view, we don't know what China's going to do. As you said, China, the Belt and Road Initiative has been curtailed quite a bit, even before COVID. And the President Xi has been very enthusiastic about a green BRI. It just has not translated. There's a huge disconnect between what the party says and what happens on the ground. But as they begin to ramp up, it will be very interesting to see what approach China takes. It looks like they are moving away from some of this really big, heavy infrastructure projects, that they'll probably be funding much less of that, much more on digital infrastructure and also what they're calling the health BRI. Maybe China will shift. One other interesting little piece that doesn't get mentioned is that another piece of sustainability, which we really haven't talked about, is a lot of the ecosystem services that the planet produces, including conserving plants and animals and all of biodiversity. And China is hosting a big convention of the parties, COP, on biodiversity in October, a month before the big climate COP in Glasgow, which is getting all the attention. And this was the biodiversity COP in Kunming, was already delayed several times because of COVID. And initially, China was all in on this biodiversity convention, conference of the parties. It's just kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit because of all the focus on the pandemic. But I think this is also a big moment for China, and they want to make it a big deal. If you noticed, it was in the readout from the meetings with John Kerry, it was mentioned as an important upcoming event. And so it's possible. I hope on this program you spend a little time focusing also on this Kunming Biodiversity COP that's coming up, because it could be an opportunity for some important advances as well, pushed by the world, but particularly by China.
Yeah, we will do a lot over the summer. We have a number of programs planned in the run-up to the COP summit in Kunming coming up in October. The article is Blue Dot, How to Raise China's Infrastructure Climate Standards. It raises all of these thorny, complex issues about China, sustainability, infrastructure, even touches on U.S. politics, written by Elizabeth Losos, a senior fellow at Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Environmental Policy Solutions, and leads a research program on sustainable infrastructure. Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining us and provoking all of these questions, these hard questions. I have to tell you, I'm very, very excited that you're an optimist. That really, we need more optimism right now, so I thank you for that.
All right. Well, thank you both for having me. It was a real pleasure.
Cobus, it's so refreshing to hear that articulation of what the United States should be doing, because we don't actually hear it that often. In many instances, especially over the past 4 or 5 years, it's been rolling back everything. So to see this proactive effort underway by the Biden administration and people like Elizabeth is refreshing. The part that I can't get my head around is that in order to get these policies over the finish line in Washington, it has to have the word China stamped on the front of it, right? In order to be confronting China, challenging China's malign influence, all of those kind of key words. This is about China. But at the same time, we also hear from people that says, well, we need to work together. It needs to be a collaborative effort where the world has to come together. Those two are completely in opposition to one another, because we can't make this about being in confrontation with China and then at the same time saying, well, it has to be in cooperation with the world working as one. How does that work?
Well, we're seeing that contradiction, I think, in the current discussions between the US and China on climate. And, we've seen some noises coming from those discussions that they are actually interested in working together on these issues, even though they are in opposition to many other issues. And this kind of contradiction of, well, we're against what they're doing in Xinjiang, but we want to work with them on climate, that is coming through, and I think both sides are probably by now hopefully spooked enough by the kind of coming climate crisis that they would be willing to find some kind of space for compromise.
No. I don't see anybody in the United States besides those who are already converted spooked on this. Again, I come back to the point of view that Americans are not going to compromise their way of life for the climate on any societal level. There's no concession being made on cutting back consumerism, eating less meat, driving less, all of the things that we know we should be doing. That's not happening. In fact, in China, it's the same thing. Beef consumption's going up, consumerism is going up. Just look at 11/11, Singles Day. We've talked about that. 30, 40, $50 billion of consumption in a single day. I don't think these societies are spooked enough about climate change.
Well, I agree with you that no one is concerned enough about climate change. One should always be more concerned about climate change. But at the same time, sure, like I see what you mean, but at the same time, we're about to, in a month or so, we're heading back into Californian fire season. California may well be burning down 500 times this year. We're seeing kind of moves in Florida, for example, like big, complicated discussions about what to do with sea level rise in places like Miami, and so on. So, I think slowly but surely, one, for example, is seeing American insurance companies starting to move towards factoring, climate change issues into their premiums a lot more comprehensively. So even though the culture itself seems forever willing to kind of to have a fight about this, U.S. companies are moving in a direction, and I think kind of generally where U.S. companies go, the culture slowly follows it, right?
Not necessarily. We're in a very polarized environment right now, and we're seeing this play out in Georgia over the question of the rollback of voter rights and voter suppression in Georgia. And some companies are going some way, and some companies are going the other way. But, coming back to this idea that the United States is going to mount an enormous multinational effort to confront China on infrastructure, I'm skeptical only because when was the last time that the United States did anything big in the world? I mean, the last big thing that I think that they did was the Iraq War. And that's not inspiring, to be honest with you. But the last time we've done a big program was maybe PEPFAR that I can think of. But we don't do big things anymore. That's just not who we are. Bear in mind, it has been 15 years, more than a decade and a half since the United States ratified a treaty in the Senate. 15 years we haven't ratified a single treaty in the Senate. I just don't know how in a society as polarized and bitterly divided as the United States is today, where there is Tucker Carlson, who is sitting there breathing down the neck of the president and the Democrats to make sure that anything that they do that he doesn't like, they hear about and mobilize the 75, 76, 77 million Americans who voted for Donald Trump. So if the idea of us mounting a real meaningful challenge requires a whole of society, whole of government approach, no way that the Americans can pull that off in the current environment.
So also not, do you think, so for example, kind of once China kind of becomes the largest economy in the world, do you think that kind of like generational shock might kind of move them forward?
I don't know. We can't agree on anything. And if we can't agree on anything, I mean, you look at the politics of the United States right now, and it's all about just scoring the cheapest point you can score. These are big, giant geopolitical issues that require some type of uniformity in the body politic to confront China and massive amount of resources. So if the Blue Dot Network is not backed by enormous amounts of money, which it probably won't, and it's just a standard setting type of thing where you get a blue dot if you make a clean piece of infrastructure, I don't think anybody in Vietnam is going to care about that. I don't think they're going to give two poops about it. They're going to say, who can deliver a piece of infrastructure at the lowest cost and the fastest pace? Now, bear something in mind here, Cobus. When I first got here in Vietnam in 2012, Sumitomo and Mitsubishi were both starting to build the Ho Chi Minh City subway. 2012, they'd started ripping up the streets. We're 2021, almost a decade later, and one line is not yet done. It is really, really hard to build infrastructure in the developing world. We talk about it as if, we can do a challenge to China and we can build infrastructure. We don't have any experience building infrastructure in the developing world. We don't have a China Road and Bridge Corporation. We don't have a CCECC. Companies with managers who have decades of experience now in working in some of the toughest environments in the world building infrastructure. We as a society just don't have that talent. The Chinese have it now. These guys who I met back in Kinshasa in 2009 and 2010 have been in the business for more than a decade building infrastructure in some of the most difficult places in the world. I don't know where the Americans are suddenly going to find that talent who knows how to build a road in Mozambique. Do you see what I'm saying? So this is, when the rubber hits the road, it's hard.
It is hard. It is definitely hard. But kind of that kind of infrastructure isn't the only thing at stake, right? Like simply having, for example, I think this kind of standard setting, if led by the US, if say the US like gives a kind of a like rolls out the Blue Dot Network, it adds its kind of like full weight behind it. Then what will hopefully happen, and I think this is obviously best case scenario, but in that case it becomes a kind of a environmental arms race, right? Kind of like who can be greener, I can see how that might have zero impact on something like road provision, but it could have a big impact on electrification, for example, right? Like so it does, if certain kind of sectors are affected by this kind of initiative, by this kind of standard setting, then okay, then that's already a step forward.
But what powers the arms race? Most arms races are powered by fear. Fear of either being killed by the next guy or being outgunned by the next guy, and that you're presumed to be weaker. Where's the motivation? I mean, again, if it's talking about climate change and that we're all going to die from rising water and desertification, we all know that today, and we've seen that is not enough of a motivation to propel people to act. So what is the motivation between that green arms race?
Well, it's two things. One I think is that sure, we knew those things theoretically, right? But we didn't feel them. And now we're feeling them. Like, we're speaking literally on a day when, the University of Cape Town its library just burned down, right? Massive tragedy. It's the world's biggest kind of repository of rare African film that's gone up in flames. It's one of the world's biggest kind of repositories of rare documents on Southern Africa have gone up. It's horrifying. It's literally a generational loss. Like we this time 100 years from now we'll still be suffering from that loss, and that's just one little moment in the wider kind of climate change story. So I think even if it might have been easy to dismiss these kind of dangers before, but it's going to become less and less easy. So there is going to be more and more pressure, I think, from the world at large, and at the same time so much of kind of Western democracy's own self-conception is running on them being number one at everything in the world, and even so in that sense, again, like if standard setting kind of kicks off some kind of arms race between them in order to just be better, then okay. Like that kind of nationalism, that kind of Cold War kind of thinking, kind of if it spurs that kind of competition, then it might be worth it.
I don't know. I get really annoyed every time I hear this conversation, and the burden gets put on developing countries to somehow make concessions when people in wealthy countries continue to consume incredible amounts of just crap, eat vast amounts of meat without any concern, drive as much as they want, have air conditioners in 3,000 square foot homes just blasting without a regard. And until the concessions are made in the quality of life and the day-to-day existence of people in the wealthy countries, I'm not going to believe that anything's going to happen. That's the indicator for me. Because to put the burden on the Vietnamese family, who was already choking on the air because of the factories making the stuff that's sold in Target and Walmart and the Apple iPhone components, that doesn't seem reasonable. And putting the burden on Africans either doesn't seem reasonable either.
Well, no, I 1,000% agree. But at the same time, this is why these rich societies, this is one of their values, right? Is that they manage to articulate new forms of the good life. Which is then exportable. So I agree with you. Like, for example, meat consumption in the US off the charts, right? Kind of says really, really problematic. However, at the same time, the US is also now the world center for plant-based meats, milks, all kinds of other forms of kind of new kind of revolutionary forms of food, right? And again, like, kind of these industries have their own big problems. A lot of them are not sustainable yet, but the fact is that they are being rolled out. And the place where they're being rolled out is the US. So, so there is even as the US is extremely problematic in lots of these ways, it is also extremely innovative in other ways. And I think, the balance always, the problem always with the US is how to balance those two things, right? And particularly how to hook those two things onto ways of self-identifying in order to kind of move them forward as a market rollout. But the thing is with the US, its weird superpower is that it has a real talent in mobilizing this kind of identity-driven consumption. So again, in that sense, who knows? Kind of like like veganism itself is becoming this kind of American, kind of way of being, right? So there is, I think, potential for to work with the culture in producing these things and then kind of popularizing them and rolling them out. I just don't know if we have enough time.
Well, work with half of the American culture, because red state America does not believe in any of that stuff. So blue state America does.
But the half of American culture is still more powerful than almost all of the other countries in the world.
And I love your optimism and faith in American culture, but it does actually end up coming down to whether or not we have enough time. Elizabeth puts the time frame almost in months, not years, when she talks about how we have the midterm elections coming up, and if the Democrats lose the House, and again, the way that 43 American states have been rolling back and adjusting their voting laws to make it more difficult to vote so that it engineers an election of a Republican president. And if a Republican president comes into power, one has to think that there's no hope that this will happen. That being said, the Republicans are very aggressive on China. So maybe they pick it up and then they go down the path with the China attitude, but we're not going to be working together as one happy world at that point. I'm not entirely sure that the John Kerry visit to China was genuine in terms of supporting the environment, whereas that when China has these big international events, like the Olympics or the COP summit coming up in Kunming, they will make all sorts of concessions to make the events a success. So my reading of the Kerry visit to Shanghai was that the Chinese were blowing rainbows up Kerry's booty in order to make sure the COP summit goes smoothly. That was my reading of it, not necessarily because they really want to work together with the United States. The depth of anger and hostility and frustration from the Chinese towards the Americans only matches the depth of the anger, frustration, and hostility of the Americans towards the Chinese. You simply cannot call a country a genocidal country and then expect to have a collaborative, cooperative, happy-go-lucky working relationship. It's just, that doesn't happen. So I'm not sure how these two countries, which do together produce 40% of the carbon emissions, and we have to work with these two countries alone to bring the climate issue under control, are going to actually work together.
Yeah, that's a big question.
I just can't see it in the current environment. I just can't see it.
I think the one thing I would say is that if projecting 20 years down the line, like whoever is a global leader at that stage, there's no global leadership without some kind of global environmental leadership. I think that ship has sailed now. There's no way that anyone can claim any form of like coherent, real global kind of big global influence without also having a significant kind of environmental aspect to that leadership. And I think that field is shifting in that direction.
I don't believe that for a second. We could not have anticipated that Bolsonaro, Donald Trump, all of the populists who won would be like that. And there's no reason to think that the populists are going to go away in the next 20 years.
But they're not leaders.
Science
right?
denying.
Like no one thinks of Bolsonaro as a leader, even in Brazil. So it's like
he's
it's
president of the country. So I mean, how many? I mean, and again, we have failed in a task. I mean, just look at human morality and how we've distributed the vaccines to fight a pandemic where the threat is immediate. It's not something 10 years down the road. And even there, we can't see the bigger picture to solve the global good. I mean, if the pandemic was a test for us, we have failed as a species.
That was what I was saying like this time last year. In retrospect, I now don't know that I 100% agree with myself. Like I agree with you. Like, you know, kind of in lots of ways this has been a shambles, right? But at the same time, and a very revealing one in the sense that the people who got hit hardest were the people who were also the most vulnerable, like globally and domestically in many countries. But at the same time, we, you know, kind of it's a year in. We have several viable vaccines, you know. So in terms of if one reads COVID just simply as a story of whether human technology can deal with a sudden massive crisis, then I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, several vaccines that are going to the rich people first. So and you know, 2% of the world's vaccines have made it to Africa.
Yeah, but they're going places. You know, they are being rolled out.
Not in any meaningful numbers right now to roll back the vaccines, and there hasn't been a concerted effort in that sense. 2% of the world's vaccines have landed in Africa. 2%. So, and again, 6 to 7 times the amount of vaccines that have been needed have been bought up by the wealthy countries. So, I mean, I think we have a very difficult time as a species to be forward thinking like that. So you've got me in a very kind of skeptical mood here today, Cobus. So I hope I haven't left everybody on a downer, but here we go. We will be covering the COP summit quite a bit over the summer. It's going to be a very important summit. It's going to be obviously from the geopolitics from the Chinese side, but also because these issues and these sustainability issues are critical to understanding the China-Africa relationship and China's engagement with the global South. It's going to be a key part, I think, of FOCAC as well, given that the COP summit will come around the same time as FOCAC. We don't know exactly when the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation Summit will happen, but it will probably be this fall. And it wouldn't surprise me if some of the themes from the COP summit do make their way into the FOCAC dialogue as well. So we'll keep our eye on that. We could go on for this conversation for a lot longer. We're going to have people like Elizabeth back on the show again to kind of talk about these issues because they do intersect, you know, between the sustainability issues, which are so important to think about, especially now that Chinese policy bank funding for infrastructure is declining, and at the same time, this effort by democracies to confront and challenge China. So we'll be talking about that a lot more, in part because Africa and other global South countries seem to be caught in the middle of a lot of this. These are the issues every single day that Cobus and I discuss in our daily email newsletter that goes out to senior level stakeholders around the world. We would love to have you part of our growing audience of readers. Sign up today, ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. It will make you smarter about what China is doing in the global South. It is the only daily digest of everything going on in China, in Africa, the Americas, Arabia, Asia. We're putting a little smattering of it all with Africa at the core of it, though. So that's really what's so very important. If you sign up today, we'll throw 20% off if you use the podcast, the promo code podcast. And also make sure that you can try it out for 30 days for free. See if you like it, cancel anytime, no obligation whatsoever. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another show. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. Or follow the guys on Twitter. Eric's at Iolanda, and you can find Cobus at Stadenesque. For more information about the China Africa Project and to sign up for our free weekly email news brief, go to ChinaAfricaProject.com.